As this series gets farther into the 20th century, we are going to encounter a new species of political party known as the mass party. The rise of the mass party was one of the most important turning points in the development of political parties worldwide. The Latin American parties that organized under this model were some of the most successful and formidable parties of their era. And by the mid-20th century, even many of the older elite parties came to adopt aspects of the mass party organization. This video is going to be an introduction to the concept of the mass political party. I am going to begin by laying out some of the dimensions of the classic mass party in Europe, where the concept was first developed. Then I will go through some examples of what a mass party can look like in the context of 20th century Latin America. Scholarship on European political parties traditionally sets the mass party in opposition to an older type of political party known as the cadre party. Cadre parties include most of the old liberal and conservative parties of 19th century Europe, along with parties like the French Radical Party. Many scholars of European politics would also consider the Democratic and Republican parties of the United States to be cadre parties, though some scholars of American politics might dispute this classification. On the other hand, most of Europe's major socialist, social democratic, and communist parties would be considered mass parties, at least during the first half of the 20th century. Some scholars would also extend the term mass party to include European Christian democratic parties, such as the Christian democratic parties of Italy, Germany, and Belgium. These labels, mass party and cadre party, denote a very different accountability relationship within the party organization. The main stakeholders in the cadre party are the party's politicians. The party exists in order to get wealthy men elected to positions of power. To the extent that the cadre party has any party bureaucracy, this bureaucracy is relatively small and it is fully subordinate to the politicians who run the party. By contrast, the main stakeholders in the mass party are the party's grassroots members and activists. Mass parties tend to have much larger and better developed bureaucracies, but at least in theory, these bureaucracies are accountable to the members and they are supposed to carry out the will of the membership. The elected officials or politicians play a relatively minor role in governing the mass party. The politicians are the party's representatives but not its leaders. Many mass parties adopted rules that require their representatives in parliament to always vote the party line or face expulsion from the party. Now, these models, as I have just described them, are archetypes. Very few real-world mass parties were ever this internally democratic in practice. Parties like the Social Democratic Party of Germany very quickly developed an entrenched leadership class within the party organization that had ceased to be accountable to the rank-and-file members by the early 20th century. However, mass parties still paid lip service to the principle that members ought to run the party organization, while cadre parties were more comfortable with the idea that the party exists to serve its politicians rather than the other way around. The rise of the European mass party was also closely intertwined with the struggle for democracy in the early 20th century. In the year 1900, most working-class citizens in Europe did not yet have the right to vote, and they were excluded from the electorate through laws that conditioned voting rights on a person's ownership of property. Some classic accounts of the mass party treat it as an alliance between these disenfranchised citizens and a group of opposition leaders and activists. All of these people are currently excluded from power, and they join together into the Mass Party in order to bludgeon their way into the political system, as the political scientist Martin Schefter famously put it. Under this account, the reason why the Mass Party is so much better developed than the Cadre Party is because it needs to be in order to survive. The existing political elite is not going to cede power without a fight, and the Mass Party requires a strong and disciplined party organization in order to withstand the substantial levels of state repression that are being directed against its members during this struggle. The Mass Party competes in elections to the extent that the current regime allows it to do so, but nobody in the party is under any illusion that they will win more than a handful of seats in parliament at a time when most of their supporters are still disenfranchised. The struggle for democracy also requires direct action outside of the halls of parliament. And so the Mass Party agitates for political change by directing its members to carry out strikes and economic disruptions. The party also demonstrates its strength through mass protests and petition drives that demand the extension of suffrage to working class voters. The purpose of this direct action is to show the current regime that this system of disenfranchisement is no longer sustainable. You cannot continue to exclude the majority of your population from the political system forever, not when that population is this well organized. Eventually, the old regime will have to give in and grant working class citizens the right to vote. And once that happens, the old liberal and conservative parties will be voted out of office, and the Mass Party will be able to take the reins of government. Other accounts of mass parties see them as the creation of the social movements that developed in Europe during the late 19th century. The organized labor movement that formed in order to fight for the economic and political rights of the working class, and the Catholic lay movement that developed in order to fight back against the liberal anti-clerical governments that ruled much of Europe during the final decades of the 19th century. Under this account, these movements sponsored their own mass parties in order to represent the broader social movement in the halls of power. The mass parties were thus agents of the social movement in the same way that the Cadre Party is the agent of its politicians. A final way to think about a mass party is as a party that produces a certain style of party membership. The membership is central to the mass party. In the words of the French political scientist Maurice Duverger, without members, the party would be like a teacher without pupils. And in Duverger's account, the mass party often saw itself as a sort of teacher. Among other things, the mass party exists in order to educate the working class, politicize it, and perhaps indoctrinate it with socialist or Christian democratic ideals. Joining a mass party was a big deal. By becoming a member of the party, you were taking on a series of obligations and duties to your party and to your comrades, your fellow members. Mass parties wanted their membership bases to be broad, but they also wanted them to be highly active. As a member, you were expected to participate in party activities, recruit your friends, work colleagues, and neighbors into the party, and participate in your party's election campaigns. Your membership in a mass party became a central part of your identity as a person. Some of the largest and best organized parties, like the Social Democratic Party of Germany, became an entire subculture unto themselves, with their own party-affiliated civil society organizations such as socialist sports clubs, socialist chess clubs, socialist choral societies, and socialist hiking organizations. The party seeped into every part of your life, including most especially your social life. The mass party's local branches may not have been the most powerful organs within the party organization, but the local branches were central to the party's mission. They kept the party grounded in the communities that it was supposed to serve, and they were a focal point for party activity and mass political participation in the local community. A concrete place where the party's members could come together to carry out party business, discuss both theory and current events with their comrades, and become more fully integrated into the internal life of the party. That is the European Mass Party. But this is a series about Latin American political parties. During the early to mid 20th century, Latin America does develop a number of parties that are widely considered to be mass parties. However, a challenge that we face in applying this concept across regions is that Latin America and Europe had very different social and political contexts at this time. And as a result, their parties also end up looking a bit different in practice. The next 5 videos of this series are going to focus on a series of socialist parties in Latin America that are clearly trying to be mass parties in the European sense of the word. Some of their founders were recent immigrants from Europe who were once members of European mass parties like the German SPD or the Italian Socialist Party. And they brought with them a very European conception of what party organization should look like. But later on in this series, we are going to meet parties that are more skeptical of the idea that European models can be transplanted into a Latin American political context. One of the most influential parties in 20th century Latin America is the American Popular Revolutionary Alliance, or APRA, which emerged in Peru in the late 1920s. A central premise behind the early APRA is that Latin America needs Latin American solutions to Latin American problems. Marxist socialism is an essentially European ideology that does not fit the social and political reality in Latin America. And for this reason, Latin America needs a Creole socialism that is better grounded in the struggles of indigenous peoples and the fight against imperialism, including European imperialism. However, when it comes to party organization, the APRA ends up emulating the European mass party model to a significant degree. The APRA is a textbook case of a party that tries to bludgeon its way into the political system by developing a mass base of support, and it spends its early years organizing the urban working class, indigenous peasants, and rural wage workers into its ranks. It develops a strong party structure based on a system of party cells that resembles the structure of many of the communist parties of that era, and it develops deep ties to Peru's organized labor movement. It also develops a deeply rooted subculture that is analogous to the subcultures of many of the European socialist parties of this era. The APRA was never trying to become a carbon copy of European parties, but it does end up looking pretty similar to a European mass party in practice. But other 20th century Latin American parties are much harder to classify, and this is especially true of the Argentine Peronist Party. Peronism emerges in the mid-1940s as a mass movement that is grounded in the working class and organized labor. As the 1946 presidential elections approached, the Peronist labor unions found the Argentine Labor Party, which was intended to be a mass party in which organized labor would play a leading role. But Perón himself had a different idea. And after he won the 1946 election, he pressures the Labor Party to dissolve itself, and he replaces it with a new Peronist party that he can more easily control. The Peronist Party organization is weaker and more loosely organized than the former Labor Party, and its structure and accountability relationships resemble those of a cadre party. But the Peronist labor activists are not very happy with this situation, and they pressure Peron to let them establish Peronist neighborhood party organizations called the Unidades Básicas, which will continue to carry out the basic organizing functions of the local branches of a mass party. So by the early 1950s, the Peronist Party has already become a rather unusual hybrid. It resembles a cadre party in the highest levels of the party organization, but it has managed to retain the vibrancy and popular participation of a mass party at the grassroots level of the organization. Already by this time, the Peronist Party looks very strange by the standards of the European conception of a political party, but it is about to become even stranger. Peron gets overthrown in a military coup in 1955 and he goes off into exile, while his followers in Argentina enter into an 18-year-long resistance against the series of mostly military governments that now hold power in Argentina. The Peronist Party has been banned, but Peronist activists continue to organize underground, taking refuge in labor unions, factories, social clubs, neighborhood organizations, and churches. So is this still a mass party by this point? It certainly does not look anything like a European mass party. And many scholars have looked at the Peronist Party during the 1960s and concluded, of course this isn't a mass party, this isn't even really a political party anymore. But an alternative view is that Peronism during the 60s had simply become a mass party that is now organized on an entirely informal basis. Peronism was no longer allowed to operate a formal party structure after 1955, but it retained informal grassroots organizations, close-knit teams of party activists, a clear political leadership, and even an informal internal hierarchy. Most importantly, it still possessed an ideologically committed mass base, and it also had the capacity to mobilize this base into strikes, protests, and even revolutionary struggle. As an organization, the Peronist Party is a chaotic mess by the late 1960s. But as a political party grounded on a popular movement, it has retained the most important features of a mass party. As this series continues, some of the elite parties that we have already covered in earlier videos are going to start to resemble mass parties as well. Based on what I have said about it so far, the Uruguayan Colorado Party might seem like a textbook example of a cadre party. At the start of the 20th century, it is still basically a political machine that is controlled by a very small group of elite politicians. But we are going to see this party democratized by the 1920s. Working class political activists are going to play a central role in running the party organization, selecting its candidates, and crafting its policy platform. And these activists are going to organize neighborhood party organizations that carry out the basic functions of a mass party's local branches, including most especially the political education function. By the 1940s, the Colorado Party has become a true mass organization with local branches in nearly every neighborhood and extremely high levels of popular participation in party activities. The party has retained some features of its earlier existence as an elite party. For example, its senior national level politicians are much more autonomous than politicians are supposed to be in a classic mass party. However, by the mid-20th century, the Colorado Party is no longer a political machine that is controlled by a small group of elites. It is now one of the most broad-based and internally democratic parties in Latin America during this era, and this is a major source of its political strength. Going forward in this series, I am not going to be applying the classic European definition of a mass party too strictly. Parties in Latin America often look different from European parties in a number of ways. Among other things, Latin American parties tend to be more informally organized on average, but this does not necessarily mean that they are any weaker than their European counterparts. I have no trouble considering the Argentine Peronist Party to be a type of mass party, even during Peronism's most chaotic period in the 1960s. I am somewhat more hesitant to call a party like the Uruguayan Colorado Party a pure mass party due to its origins as an elite party. But I do think it is important to recognize that this party underwent major organizational changes that pushed it in the direction of a mass party. Latin American elite parties were often more successful than their European counterparts at adapting to the new political environment of mass democracy, and one of the ways that they did this was by evolving into mass-based organizations. This was a central reason why parties like the Colorado Party remained the leading political forces in their countries through the end of the 20th century.